the challenges that's coming out of this New Age movement, and it's not just a New Age, there's lots of groups that do it. And I come from the New
Yes.
Age movement, so I don't have anything like bad about New Age in general, is that sometimes we're getting stuck in certain terms, and it is the stuckness that is a problem overall. What we're really looking for, in my opinion, is flow. If you are balanced always, there is no growth because you need to step out of that. You need to have
Yep.
movement in order for growth to happen. I hear this music and I follow it, and I find this box that's connected to a plant, that's connected to a speaker, and there's music, and I'm listening to this music, and it's as if the plant is just talking to me.
Hey y'all, I'm Reese, and welcome to Making Meaning, a podcast by the Cohere Collective here to help guide you along your path to make meaning in a way that makes sense for you. And this week, I am joined by the lovely Tigrilla Gardenia. Tigrilla truly has such a breadth and depth of experience in so many differing worlds, from music and creativity and design to plant life and plant advocacy and ecosystem thinking, as well as community teachings and buildings and esoteric traditions and practices, all of which she uses in her work to help people bridge the gaps between their own, in her words, multipotentialities, which I think is just such a captivating word. It truly captures so much of what it is that we're trying to talk about here, but helping people bridge the gaps between their multipotentialities to live with purpose and intention and in a way that makes this world a meaningful place for us all to cohabitate in with one another, both us as human beings, but also with our other than human brothers, sisters, and siblings. In this episode, we truly get into it all, from Tigrilla's background, growing up in Miami as a Cuban American, and this idea of home and how culture really informs a lot of her work and everyone's identity as we're traversing the meaning-making project, and language and how that is such an important foundational element of meaning making, but also the idea of musicality as even more foundational than language, and that perhaps is a window into meaning making across species, but also across the apparent separation between self and other. In addition to all of her amazing academic achievements, Tigrilla is also a citizen of Damanhur, one of the world's largest spiritual eco-communities. And I am just enamored with hearing her discuss what it is like to live in this world and this culture with other people, and it was just such a joy to ask so many questions about it, and has certainly entered my bucket list as some place that I would hope to visit and just learn more about in the future. If you are interested in learning even more about Tigrilla Gardenia and her work, there will be links to check out her writings and workshops and everything else in the description down below, wherever you may be listening or watching this episode. And if you're interested to learn more about the Cohere Collective and the Making Meaning podcast, there will be links to do that down below as well. Okay, that is all I have for you. So as always, let's take a deep breath. And get started. Well, Tigrilla, thank you so very much for joining me today. I've been so looking forward to this conversation, and I just think we're going to go in a bunch of different really cool directions. So thank you for your time and energy today.
Oh, I'm excited. This is going to be fun.
Absolutely. Well, first and foremost, the first question I like to ask to just set the tone for our conversation is, what is one thing you're grateful for right now?
I'm grateful to be home. I'm super grateful. I just flew in last night. I did have one flight canceled, and it could have been so much worse. Right after I left, there was turbulence. A lot more flights were canceled from my first destination, for where I was leaving from. And then the second flight, lots of people didn't get on it. And so I am just grateful that everything happened and I ended up coming home last night.
Absolutely, absolutely. There's nothing like revisiting your bed, and I'm always like, I always miss my bathtub when I'm away too. I'm like, I
Ugh.
need my bathtub and my bed, and we're back.
Yep.
Before I ask my next question that I always ask, I am curious about what the word home means to you. I
Mm.
know that you have a very unique relationship with community and how that affects your style of living, but I would love to know what that word means to you, what it carries for you, and how you conceptualize of this sometimes overly simplified, but actually quite conceptually broad idea of home.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating question because up until only a few years ago, like I've moved a lot. I spent, I still consider where I was right before this, which I had gone to visit my mother and my friends, my hometown. And when I'm in my hometown, other than the living situation, because my mother's house is kind of small, everything else really still feels so much like home. I have some amazing friends that I go out with, not so much as like somebody on vacation, but just the same you would go out with any friends in any time. So that's always been this anchor point for me. And now I've over the last few years switched the language to be hometown instead of
Mm,
home, because it really does feel like that's like my anchor point that connects so many parts of my microlines of who I am, my identity, and all this stuff. And then I didn't use the word home for a long time because I lived in so many different places. I was on tour with Cirque du Soleil. I traveled around after I left them. And so it's only been in the last few years that I used to use the idea of like my home base. So I live in Damanhur. It's one of the largest spiritual communities in the world. I live in the first city, which is kind of like the main area where everything first started and where our temples of humankind and our government and everything that is like the heart of the community is. And so my two words were like hometown and home base. I have this way, it's probably the Taurus in me, that wherever I show up, I have to unpack. And even if I'm only there 3 days, that becomes home. And it's only been recently that, Damanhur, the first city of Damanhur, feels like, no, no, that's the place I go back to. That's like
mm,
home, home. And then, there are the other places that I visit, and then there's my hometown. So I kind of still alternate sometimes between home base and just home. But right now, after spending 3 weeks away, and I'm about to leave in another 2 days, and I'm going to be gone for another week because I travel quite a bit for different things, for work and for the community. And I'm like, no, no, this is home. like, like, and it's not even the place. Like for me, it's not so much even the physical location of where I am physically located right now. It is Damanhur. Like wherever Damanhur is, that is home. And so right now, it's the first city. Um, on Thursday, it'll be like in a few days, it'll be in Croatia in our center there and in our ritual circle. And then a few days after that, it's going to be in Hungary and our Damanhurian Magoro territory. And so it's like, those are home. But so the concept is like, if I'm in my Damanhurian, like that's home. And then this is
mm,
my home base. And then that is my
yes.
hometown. So it's
Yes.
kind of this funny concept of that.
Absolutely. And I'm excited to dive deeper into Damanhur and everything that that means, and this idea of home being much more broad and expansive and fluid as well. But before we dive too far into all of that, I do want to go back to, what is your story? How did you get to here? I know you briefly mentioned Cirque du Soleil and of course your hometown, but whatever you feel called to share in this moment, I would love to hear all about your story.
So my story is super varied. So I'll probably just give you the highlights and then we can dive into any one of them because if not,
Sounds
we might
great.
hear for a while. So my hometown is Miami. I am a Cuban American and I say those with a lot of pride. I was just talking with my brother about this, about how unique we are considered what's called Generation Añe. We're the first children born out of the exile, like after our parents had to leave the island for many different reasons when communism came in. And luckily, those of us that went to Miami, especially like my parents who went to Venezuela, and then they went to New York, and then they went to Miami. But those of us that kind of grew up in Miami had the benefit of having both cultures. Not so much a fusion, but literally both. And I
Mm,
always find that extremely unique because many immigrant populations had to hide their culture, their original birth cult, like where they come from, and completely assimilate, or they tried to like merge things. And we had the absolute benefit of both. I mean, we would celebrate the 4th of July and Thanksgiving with like turkey and hot dogs and hamburgers and all the things that are in, and then Jose Marti Day and, the salsa music and playing dominoes in the streets, because we were able to live and still are able to live in a lot of ways, both of those cultures fully. And I feel really privileged for that. And I talk about it because it really did inform a lot of who I am. There's a lot of, probably, if you think about it, things that many other immigrant populations have that we as Cubans didn't at that time, and that experience didn't have to experience. I mean, we almost didn't realize we were the immigrants because of the
mm,
way Miami wasn't built up. We built it up. Our parents, came and they had businesses and they continued going. And it's actually considered one of the fastest integrating immigrant populations in the United States. And so
wow.
it's a very unique cosmos that got created. So that's kind of like the foundation upon which everything is. And then I went away for college and then came back and ended up finding that the best school in the country for what I wanted to study was in my backyard. So my background is actually in music engineering and electrical engineering. And so the music scene, especially in the era that I grew up, we were just talking about it with my friends. It was like such a feverish moment. There were so many amazing groups that were playing, so many studio musicians and incredibly talented musicians that came out of that area. Bands like Marilyn Manson and Matchbox 20 that made it really big. Others that were kind of on the brink, and there was a lot of drugs. There was a lot of other stuff that was happening. It was like the whole Miami Vice era type perspective. And that really did also inform a lot of those aspects. So I left Miami and went to Seattle for 11 years. I worked in the kind of bringing the internet, audio and video into the internet, and then
Mm,
went over to Microsoft. So I had this like kind of startup in real networks that was very fast paced and all the movement and the internet bubble as it was growing. And then Microsoft, which was really big, really stable in a lot of ways, but still had that same kind of energy. Anyways, to make a very long story short, because if not, I'll keep going forever. I, I left that world when I decided to go back into the music scene. And in this case, going from the rock and roll scene that I had been in before and the Latin rock scene that I had grown up with and been a part of when I was working directly in that, into the electronic music scene. I started a production company with a partner and started to produce large dance parties. And this is probably where my foray going back into kind of spiritual transformation steps back in. This is a group that was very tied not just to the music, but to the possibilities that music have to transform us, to change us, to evolve us, and very much using magic and esoteric knowledge, which brought me into Kabbalah and sacred
mm,
geometry. And Kabbalah was probably, I mean, I had always dabbled, my family being, of course, a Cuban family, had roots in many different things and knowledge of many different kinds of religions and studies and philosophies and even, magic and such. But I just dabbled and played, and then I let it all go while I was in Seattle, and building my kind of normal life, to
right.
then dive back into it with this group of extremely creative alternative kids, things that I had never thought was possible in my own life. And that brought me back, kind of like brought up all these parts of myself, this magician that had been hiding to a certain extent, or kind of didn't really have an outlet for it. So that really brought that out inside of me. And it was great because my first teacher in that world, who turned into a very good friend, is Dr. Teresa Bullard, which anybody who watches Gaia knows her. She was at that time getting her PhD in physics in alchemy. And so my business partner said, "Oh my goodness, if I really want to get you into this world of magic, and I know you need it through a very logical, like, I know how your mind works. You're an engineer. You're like, you've worked in tech, like, this thing. Come to one of her presentations. You're going to love her. And sure enough, she and I became great friends because she had that science kind of mind mixed with the esoteric mind. And then I just went into so many different, so I'm a multi-passionate. I went into lots of different things. I'm here producing events. I got really back into art. I love art of all sorts, music as well as art, and the performing arts. And so I started to work with a circus. I became a co-owner of a circus and was producing circus events. And then my partner said to me, my a romantic partner at that time, says, I really want to go on tour with Cirque du Soleil. He was somebody that worked for me and my company and had been a part of my circus. And I was like, all right, let's make it happen. And so we made it happen. And I left the United States about 20 something years ago now on a tour with Cirque du Soleil. He was actually a carpenter and a technician. And I, at the time, was on along for the ride. I was still teaching at this point. By this point, I'm like producing events in the United States. I'm teaching esoteric topics like sacred geometry, and I'm starting off my Kabbalah work and moving into these things. And we toured. And when I came off tour, I realized I didn't want to come to the United States again. I was not ready. I didn't really have a place where I was going to stop. Seattle was no longer home. It never had really felt like home. And Miami, it had been a long time since I had been in. And so I just went off to go study French and then tour around Europe for a bit, and ended up in Barcelona, where I spent many years teaching. And then one day, Teresa Bullard, Dr. Bullard's sister, was coming through town and was like coming to visit me. And she was on her way to Italy. So she's like, hey, since I'm heading to Italy, what if we meet up there and come and go to that place, Damanhur, we had heard people talk about? And I was like, I know very little. I had been a part of a course that they did way back when I was still in Seattle, and I was part of a different esoteric school, but I hadn't followed anything. I didn't get any details. I didn't even stay through the whole course. And so we came for what I thought was going to be a weekend. And I came for a weekend, met some really incredible people. And when I was telling somebody my background, which of course, producing events, I had a lot of marketing, I had a lot of event production, I had a lot of tech experience. I knew websites, I knew the internet really well because I had been there at the birth of the internet. And so when I was telling her all this stuff, she was like, oh my God, we need you here. And I looked at her and I said, absolutely not. You live in houses with like 20 people. I would kill somebody. That was my answer. So much so that when I came back home, I remember my roommate says to me, hey, you're going to have to find another place to live because I'm leaving the country. Simultaneous to this, my mother calls me up and is like, are you moving again? And I was like, no, no, no. I'm not going to go there. Like, I can't do this. And then that one of the people I meet calls me and says, hey, would you be willing to come here for 6 months to do a work exchange? Like, we really would love you to build out a project that we have. And you seem like a great person. Like, come and do this work exchange with us. And I was like, well, I have to find a new place to live anyway. So I might as well just go there 6 months. I'll check out this project. I'll meet some cool people. And then I'll come back to my home, which at the time was Barcelona. And I really felt it. Like, it's the closest place to Miami that makes me feel like home. Like, I feel, I breathe. This is good. And yeah, that was 15 years ago. I'm still here. So needless to say, that didn't turn out as planned. Like, I was like, okay, so new adventure it is. And here I fell in love with a musical plant. And that was another sort of grand, like, just like the whole magic, esotericism, the whole music scene. There was a also dark performance scene. I do piercing and suspension work too, and body modification. So I had been like body modification world, hippie, trance music's world, techie, what today are the tech bros, but back then they weren't the tech bros. They were the techs, right, whatever the heck we were, everything mixed together people. I have like all these different pieces. And I'm in Damanhur and I hear this music and I follow it and I find this box that's connected to a plant, that's connected to a speaker, and there's music and I'm listening to this music and and it's as if the plant is just talking to me. You know, when you hear, like, if you've ever learned, I speak multiple languages, and whenever you're learning a new language, there's that time when comprehension comes in and somebody's speaking
Mm.
to you and you're like, wow, I actually understand what you're saying to me.
Yeah, yeah.
That was exactly what it was like with the plant. It was like, whoa, you're making a music. And this to me sounds like speech. Like, what are you talking to me? And it was fantastic. And that took me down another rabbit hole of science. I ended up really getting into the music of the plants as well as plant communication, ended up getting a master's degree in vegetal future. So plants, social
Mm.
innovation and design, and going down the rabbit hole of like biomimicry for social innovation and the whole idea of like, how does all of this world of social innovation fit into natural models? How do we co-create with plants? What does consciousness mean? What does,
Yeah.
like, there's just so many different things. So that gets us to pretty much where I am today. So today I am a nature inspired mentor and a certified life coach. So I also got my ICF PCC certification, because really what I love is, what I found is like the through line that takes me through all these different experiences actually have one continuous through line, which is, or we call it a deep pattern in biomimicry. And my deep pattern is I bridge from where you are or where something is to where it needs to go or where it wants to go. And that bridging happens across all these different things that I've told you about.
Mm-hmm.
And it passes through deep understanding, like ridiculously out of control empathy to a certain extent, that allows me to enter into where you are, then find the language that you're speaking, and then
Right.
pull you across the bridge. So walk with you across the bridge and teach you what you need to do to be over here, and or help you explore and discover what it is. And plants really help me with that, because if there's anybody who knows how to create rich relational fields, it's plants. And exchange is the language of life. And so
Mm.
it's like I do all of this in Damanhur. I have many different roles, where the main one is I help our international initiates around the world really coordinate and connect into the federal system that we have in place. And I'm also a part of some other projects, but it's really always doing the exact same thing. I mean, sometimes it's tech, sometimes it's performance, sometimes it's music, sometimes it's science, sometimes it's this, or sometimes it's that. But ultimately, for me, it's all the same through line, which is that bridging of from A to B and helping people go from A to B and connect to what they need in order for them to do, what they need to do or what they want in life. That was a really long answer. I'm going to drink my tea now.
No. Please do. I so appreciate it. Thank you for sharing. And I'm so excited to dig into there's so many different things here that I'm so excited to dig into. But let's go back to the beginning a little bit. In Miami, we're here, and one thing that really sticks out to me about this chapter that also seems very connected to what you were just talking about bridging. But I thought it was so fascinating how you were describing being able to hold both cultures. It wasn't this blending. So often people talk about the United States as a melting pot, but recently, well, and I say recently, I think I actually heard this in high school, so it's oh my gosh, almost 10 years ago now. But that the United States is actually more like a mixed salad where, yes, everything is together, but it's not becoming one mixture compound. Like the tomato is still the tomato and the onion is still the onion, but we're existing in this bowl together. And while I think that's really lovely, I don't know how successful that actually is in every single area of the United States. And having this fusion versus both, this like being able to coexist versus having to make them together, what really feels like the difference there between integration and assimilation to you? And I know you mentioned that you felt very grateful to have this more integrative experience. But I'd love to hear more about what that looks like and perhaps how we as individuals, like I born in the United States, grew up in a very white dominated culture. Assimilation was something that people spoke about, and I'm in Texas as well. So
Hmm.
a lot of people are very much like immigrants come and we want them to assimilate. They need to become a part of our
Right.
culture. And I would just love to hear more about why integration and sustaining multiple cultures together is so fruitful. Hey y'all, it's Reese just briefly interrupting our conversation to ask you how you're enjoying it so far and to ask you what you think about this concept of language and its relationship to meaning making. I really do think it is one of the most foundational concepts to what I do and something that my research has been diving into more and more. And I would love to just hear from you about what came up for you as we began talking about language and that dimension of meaning making and how that adds this element of community and communication to the idea of meaning making. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, for language to exist is to imply community, is to imply a relationship with something external to the self, which deeply impacts the way we go about making meaning. So let me know. And if you are enjoying the podcast, please subscribe. Give this episode a like, a 5-star rating and review, and just let me know in the comments down below what else you're enjoying. I truly, not only does it help the podcast grow, which is just so great. I would love for a conversation like this to be reaching so many people's ears, but also it just helps me in the creative process of continuing to build making meaning co-creatively with you into something that we all really want to continue enjoying and learning from each other with, especially as we're rounding out the end of season 4 with this episode. I'm deep in the planning phases of season 5, and I would love to really incorporate a lot of your thoughts and feedback and opinions into that. So definitely let me know. Subscribe, give us a like, and let's head back to the conversation.
Yeah, so this is something I've had lots of especially in the recent political climate. This comes up a
Mm-hmm.
lot, and why, and Miami itself has changed in the last, especially the last 10, 15 years, where it is very different because and this isn't like a better or worse, but just different. Like the South American culture that has come in, I don't think has felt as comfortable as we did with the bothness. Like my
Mm,
mother came over already speaking English. My mother spoke English when she arrived. My father quickly learned it because he had to for the type of work he was doing.
sure.
And my mother never, like, I see a similar thing in Norway. I do a lot of things with Norwegians. And I
Mm,
think one of the reasons I feel connected is because I get a sense of this type of what I'm about to talk about in Norway as well, where many Norwegians speak English, and yet at the same time, Norwegian culture is still very, very strong. Like you didn't
right.
lose Norwegian, where in other places you see that the more they learn English, the less they know their own culture. And I think that
There's very
that's
much a language representation of how prevalent everything else is.
exactly, well, and language does define culture. So the moment you
Mm,
start speaking a different language, you have that culture, that form of whatever it is, whether we're talking about English or here myself in Italian. Like when I speak in Italian, I am entering into the Italian culture, and I'm referencing everything that I am through the lens of an Italian culture. So I'm
mhm.
using Italian idioms, I'm using Italian expressions, and I am adapting, as you said, my Italianness, my Americanness or my Cubanness, depending on what I'm doing. I am adapting it into that language. And even with Spanish, like um, the Spanish that I might speak with my mother is different than the Spanish I speak with somebody else, like my friend who's from Spain. And so even there, but there's a closeness because there's an easier way of like when I use a word, for example, I remember using, you had mentioned earlier, bathtub. The way we in Cuba say bathtub and the way Spaniards say bathtub are two different words. And I remember using that with somebody one day and she corrected me. And I said, why are you correcting me? She's like, because you used the wrong word. You used bañadera and it should be bañera. And I said, no, bañadera is a perfectly good word. And she's like, no, that doesn't exist. You just made it up. So we had to pull the dictionary out. Back then, it was a paper dictionary. And it said, bañadera, mostly used in Cuba. And I was like, kind of thing.
It exists.
It exists, right? So you still have to do a little bit of that. But the reason that I think it was so great was, for example, we all speak perfect English. So there is the ability for you to enter into one culture and then jump into the other. We do Spanglish, and my mother especially speaks a lot of Spanglish now. But, when I was growing up, we spoke English and we spoke Spanish, and you could hop between the two based on what you were saying. And some of our Spanglish is about cultural references. So if it's not so much I used to think it was a lack of vocabulary. It's not. If I'm talking about flip-flops, just as regular shoes, I'm going to say the word flip-flop. But if I'm talking about the fact that Hispanic parents pick up the freaking flip-flop and will throw it at your head when you're being a dork, we call it a chancleta because it has a different reference point. It's not about the shoe at that point. It is about the projectile object, which there are now a few. Thank you to Marcelo Hernandez on Saturday Night
SNL.
Live. Exactly. Thanks to him, he's bringing it in where he's like, la chancleta means something. The same as like the Danish cookie jar, the cookie tin, but for Danish cookies. For us, that's a sewing kit. That's always a sewing kit. You never find cookies in that. It is always a sewing kit. And now we lived with those dual references and we called them by that reference, cultural reference, but that doesn't
specificity.
That specificity. And yet if I was in a business setting or like I remember when I was in high school, we had, one of the many kind of politically type things that enters into a high school. And we had to go to a meeting of the school board. I was perfectly dressed as a good, American. I spoke in English and I was able to represent, what it was because it wasn't a topic that was culturally relevant in that particular moment. It was something about education. And yet at the same time, I could have had in front of something else, like speaking in front of, the daughters of, Cubans or whatever thing. And I could have had it in Spanish with a lot of our cultural references. So I think that the difference is, I don't want to say, I know it's going to sound wrong, so I'll say it and then I'll correct it or like massage it a little. It's like knowing where the place was. Like, when am I talking about a chancleta, which is, yes, if I'm talking about like, oh, I'm going to put my chancletas on, I'm going to go outside. Sure, if I wouldn't say that in English. I would say in English, I'm going to go put my flip-flops on and I'm going to go inside. But if I'm talking, or if I'm saying it in Spanish, me voy a poner la chancleta y voy a salir, right? I can say it in either language. But if I'm going to talk about the chancleta in reference to your mother throwing that at your head, then it doesn't matter what language I'm going to speak. I'm going to be like, oh my God, the other day I was talking to my mom and I said the stupidest thing and she took out the chancleta and she threw it at me.
It carries something so different.
Exactly. And so I feel like that is really the beauty of growing up in a time and in a place where there was deep respect for both cultures. We didn't feel necessarily discriminated against, probably because we are colonialist. I mean, we're lighter skinned. We come from a Spanish background, so we're more European. And so there was an acceptance of the island coming at it. And so even though my father didn't have a formal education and my mother did have a formal education, he was a very good business person. And therefore there was a respect of like, oh, if you're a Cuban from the late 1950s, early 1960s, all the way through maybe to the end of the 1960s, you probably came to build something and you were going to maintain American traditions while still building out your Cuban traditions. And you were going to teach your children. My mother even still says it. it's my job to teach you your customs and your habits of what it meant to be Cuban. And it was your school and your county and everything that happens around you that was teaching you how to be a good American. So I know civics. I know how to, I know how to carry out myself. I know how to do business. I know how to do that. And I also know how to make, arroz con pollo, and I know how to throw a chancleta, and I know how to, carry a handkerchief that is, in what's it called? Embroidered by
Embroidered.
my great aunt. Like I know how to do both. And in that way, and I feel very comfortable knowing which one to pull on for
Right.
the situation. And I think that's the difference between assimilation and completely and integrating in both.
Right. Absolutely. Did you ever feel like, to use the words that you just used, being a good American or being a good Cuban were at odds with one another? And hearing your story of when you went to the school board and you spoke in entirely English and were dressed appropriately per United States customs, I would imagine, I could just imagine for myself, if I had a classmate that transitioned into a few Spanish words to try and be more specific, that could be something that was almost looked down upon as opposed to just a part of how this person presents whatever argument or discussion they're trying to make in this presentation to the school board. Was that ever something that you confronted? And do you think that we, as a culture, I know now you're in Europe, but as a culture, do you feel like we're moving in a direction of being able to hold both in this integrated way with acceptance, or these questions of tolerance when these two concepts may be at odds? Am
Yeah,
I making sense
you
here?
are
Okay.
making sense. And it is a really difficult, it's a fascinating topic and one I think about a lot, especially recently. Like I said, Miami has changed a lot in the years, just using
Mm-hmm.
Miami as an example, although I
Of
think it's
course.
very similar to many other places. I think of it a lot also because now that I live in Italy, when I go to the United States and I hear people tell me, oh, I'm Italian, and I look at them and I'm like, no, you're not. Because and with all the respect, but no, your parent, your great, great, great grandparents might have been just the same as my, grandparents, and my mother is Cuban. I am, of course, not the same type of Cuban as she is because
Right.
I did grow up in the United States. And no, you, all the food you're talking about there is no fettuccine Alfredo in Italy.
No. Oh my goodness.
There
So
is no.
I just have to share a little bit because I actually lived in Florence about a year ago. I lived in Florence for about a year and was taking Italian language classes there just for my own edification and experience. And I do have ancestry through Italy, but I'm very aware I'm a white girl. It's I am American white girl. And so coming back and going to an American Italian food place, and I'm there should not be cream in anything. There should not be cheese in anything unless it's Parmesan we're sprinkling on after, or it's
Right.
all of the little things. So I
There's
hearing you
cream
say
where
there's
I
no.
am because I'm in the north, but I
Okay.
totally agree with
Okay.
you. Most of and just the same as the spaghetti, there's so many pieces of that. And I think that's
Yeah.
going back to what we were talking about. I think that is the difference where I think many of those cultures, unfortunately, were, I know of a lot of friends that they were told by their parents or their grandparents, we're not teaching you Italian or we're not teaching you Spanish in other places because we want you to be American and you need to be American. And on the other side of it, I am also seeing the places where you don't learn English and you don't have that understanding of English or of even the basic. I admit it, I live in Italy, I speak perfect Italian. Knowing how the government works, yeah, somewhat. I know some parts of things because we're very politically, active, but
Involved.
I do not know other things. And I admit I would never call myself Italian because of that. Where
Sure.
when I lived in Spain, I would much more likely be going towards being Spanish, not because I speak the language, but because culturally speaking, obviously Cubans, my family line of Cubans comes from Spain. So therefore I was interested in like, what does the prime minister look like? Like, what is the president or whatever, what are these pieces of the government? And I think that that's another element. But the most important thing I think is to feel comfortable holding both
Mm,
and again, it goes back to that Norwegian, using a completely different example that probably doesn't have the biases or maybe even like racism that sometimes we're thinking about, especially right now in the
right.
United States. Because I can't speak, like when people talk to me about being Mexican, I'm like, I cannot actually conceptualize what it was like for many of friends of mine. Like I remember when I was living in Seattle, one of the people that I worked with was Mexican and we were talking about something. And when I started to speak to him in Spanish, he looked at me like I was an alien, not because he didn't speak it, but because he was like, "You're in public. What are you doing?" And I was like,
Yeah.
"What do you mean?" Like, like I only
This
speak in
is,
Spanish to
yeah, yeah,
my like I only speak with my mother in Spanish, even though my mother reads, speaks, like has done business, has done everything in English most of her life. And yet, that's just the way it is. And it's kind of like going back to that Norwegian culture where I deal with many Norwegians that have spoken English and some that speak English the same as I do. Like, but I also hear the concepts that are Norwegian that they go into in Norwegian, and you're like, that's your culture. It's so strong.
right,
It's not being lost, where I think some other places that have adopted English have lost their cultural language. Or when I lived in Barcelona, for example, one of the big conflicts was between Spanish and Catalan and English,
mm,
because Catalan was regional, of course, it's that area and there's a lot of pride in it. But Spanish is the overall country and the second most widely spoken language in the world. And English is the most widely spoken language in the world. And they were still at the phase where they were struggling with which one of these three, like, which is the one that we teach in school? They couldn't conceptualize the idea of
right.
teaching all of them in school, like, and of switching based on subject matter or other things. So they had just passed a law in the period that I was in where all of English was in Catalan. And we were like, this is the silliest thing I have ever heard, because it is only spoken in the region of Catalonia. Like, it's not spoken anywhere else. You are depriving your children of both the number one and number two languages, most popular languages in the world. What are you
Right.
doing? Like, what are you doing? For something that I completely agree should be spoken.
Right.
Absolutely. Because it brings a heritage that is so strong, that is so old, that is so pronounced, different
Mhm.
from the other regions, like every region that has its own language. And yet you're depriving your children of interactivity with the rest of the world
Right.
for that
Accessibility.
accessibility and that.
Yeah.
So,
I think it's so interesting too, because when I think about like what an English class is growing up, it's not just like, of course, you have grammar classes and sentence diagramming, which is slowly going away, and cursive and all of the technical things,
right.
right? But as you grow up, it's also literature and poetry. It's the most exposure to plays and performing arts, but also I remember in my American literature classes, we read the Declaration of Independence and like very important American quote unquote American documents that were important to history and how it taps into
Right.
culture in so many ways. And I think that that just speaks to exactly what you're saying, that language is kind of a vessel for how culture is carried and communicated, and to be able to hold both languages and is also a signifier of being able to hold both cultures and have space for both, and also wanting future generations to be able to engage and learn
Mhm.
and explore across cultures, and then maybe, pick up practices or anything that works for them from all sorts of different cultures.
And I wanna
And
oh, sorry, I interrupted you.
no,
I
no, no,
got I
no, no,
got
no.
excited about something and a concept, and I interrupted. Finish.
No,
Sorry.
I, I was just going to go on to this, how culture is evolving. If you think that we're moving in a positive direction with this and
Mhm.
being able to hold both, and being in Texas, I'll just be quite frank that I am fearful of being able to hold both, being
Right.
absolutely obliterated, being something that there is just no space for, because it's frankly dangerous for a lot of people. Like the anecdote that you shared of this person that you started speaking Spanish to, like, we're in public, we don't do
Right.
that. Like it being so fear based. So I was just curious about opinions on what direction we're moving in, and perhaps how we as individuals that are trying to hold different cultures and learn from different cultures might do so in our own lives. But also, whatever thought concept you had, please do
Yeah.
not lose that
I
thread either.
I I definitely agree with you that I think we have, uh there's a fear of both sides. One, that a person's cultural reference gets, like you said, obliterated. Like, I completely stop. And not only because I remember another friend of mine who, again, was of Mexican heritage up in the Pacific Northwest, who not only did he not speak the language, but he had nothing. Like, he had nothing, no traditions, no stories, all the richness that we grew up with, from fairy tales to, our moral stories, and to all of these other pieces, music and dance. And can you imagine a world with no salsa? Like, absolutely
Ugh.
not. And so, we have all of that that gets lost. And at the same time, I feel like there's this perception of I'm going to hunker down in place, and therefore I'm going to sit in the United States, but I'm going to reject American culture too, because that brings all. So it's like it's a lose-lose situation.
Mm.
And
Hmm.
especially, or I learned the bare minimum. And I think that's probably another aspect that's different. Like, when I was, I acted for a while. I did some films and I did a lot of theater, and I really loved it. And one of the things that I learned in that process was the importance. It hit me better. Why is it that you learn Shakespeare in high school? It is not
Right.
just for the stories, which are amazing, and it is not just for the theater and the expression. It's also for the nuance of language, which is what we need in order to better understand ourselves. I remember having a teacher, because I was taking some acting classes, and specifically around Shakespeare, who encouraged me to get the Oxford English Dictionary, which at the time that I got there was two kinds. There was like the full multi-volume set of the Oxford English Dictionary, and then there was which is what I got. And I am so sad to say that only about last year I finally had to give it away, because it was in the United States and I could not figure out how to bring this hunkin volume. And now I'm kicking myself for it,
Right.
because it's basically like a 2 foot by foot book. It's two books with print so tiny that it actually at the top has a little drawer for a magnifying glass. And you pull out the book and you open it to any word. Let's take the word will, for example. So the idea was, when you're reading Shakespeare, is that you should take every word and go into that dictionary and pull out all of the definitions, going back to its original etymology, because each definition of that word will give you a different nuance of what Shakespeare wanted to share. And you start to realize that within a single text, there are many different stories floating. So, for example, Will was his name, so he could have been self-referencing. But will also means desire, right? The will to do something. And also will is the power, the strength to do it. But will also means penis. Will, so like where the concept of a willy comes from. And so you have all these nuances that then when you go back and you read the text, you're like, oh, which one was he talking about? And where was he going, and what happens when I interpret? And that piece of language, which kind of goes back to the whole reason why I got into plant music and why I love learning languages in
Hmm.
general, allows me to communicate with somebody in a much more in a richer way, and to recognize that when a person speaks to me, I can't take, people say, oh, well, I take you at face value. Which face value? Because
Right.
I don't know which of these definitions that person is intending to use. So when I say also the richness of both languages is that, and of both cultures, is that the way that we grew up, we learned, at least in my generation, especially because I went to a school up until junior high that was bilingual. And so I got to learn those same kinds of nuances in both languages, which means I had the
Mm,
cultural references nuanced across those languages. Hence
yes.
why I know that there's bañera and bañadera, or why I know that there's entusiasmo and embullo, and what are the cultural differences. Or, Cubans use the word guagua for a small bus rather than autobús or a bus or whatever. And all of these small types of little nuances means I'm much more open to listening to somebody else, because I want to hear, where are you coming from? Who are you? And so when we go into things like politics, or we go into hard subjects like the situations that we have right now in the world, those of us that have that have are more open to like saying, well, what are you really saying? Where are you going with this? And what is it that you like? I
Yeah,
don't take things as
absolutely.
only my definition.
It allows for so much more room for nuance and
Mhm.
paradox as well, is
Right.
also something that I'm hearing. And this ability for your meaning not to be the only one, not to be the only interpretation across experience, right? Not
Exactly.
just like literary analysis, but across what it means to be a human being living in this world and
Right.
engaging in culture and community and living with one another, as we all have to do if we want to be a part of society, which it's impossible not to be. In some ways, I'm sure someone somewhere has tried and has done it, but there's an exception to every rule.
Right.
But I do think that it's so important to create space. And I think that it also, in terms of education, goes back to this idea of like your sentence diagramming, your Shakespeare monologue memorizing in your high school English class, as banging your head against a brick wall as that may have felt. I really think there's so much value in, we're trying to teach people how to think,
Right.
how to ask questions, not how to answer questions, not how to rote memorize things. And I think that the breaking down of, okay, but why are we asking students to read sonnets? Why are we asking students to go back to the Declaration of Independence and break down what each word means?
Mhm.
Because it gives you a foundation for asking these questions moving forward, not just of yourself, but of your leaders, of those in power,
Right.
of the stories that you're told, and of other people,
Right.
and being able to build communities. I think that this is just so, so vitally important and beautiful. And actually, I think takes us really beautifully into this question of music, because music is absolutely a language of its own and a vessel for culture as well. I mean, my goodness, dance as well is a
Mhm.
language. And I also just have to throw out there, because she is so on my heart right now, my old great mentor. Well, I say old mentor. She is still my mentor. She will always be my mentor, but I don't work with her quite as often anymore. Who first taught me about Shakespeare and digging into the text of things. And I just have to shout out Miss Catherine Hart. She is wonderful, and I'm sure she has shivers right now knowing that we're having this conversation. But music as a language and how that carries movement through dance. Um, that takes us into the next part of your story as well, that this was something that first returned you to the idea of the esoteric, of hermeticism, of magic. And I very much personally, in my own magic practice, think of magic as a language,
Mhm.
as a way to think about these concepts. And the same way any language or dialect is sort of a formula for
Absolutely.
communicating an energy that's very similar to what a ritual is. It's a formula for generating, creating energy, taking something intangible and bringing it back to the tangible. So, all that to say, I would love to hear a little bit more about the way you described this when you first were talking about it, as you said all of the possibilities that music has to transform us. And that just made me think so much of manifestation, not in the I hate using the phrase new age, but not in the new age manifestation sense, but in this like deep magical sense of bringing something
Absolutely.
to bear with your will, as you're speaking about. What possibilities does music have to transform us? And why do you think it was those possibilities that led you to magic, back to the magician inside of you?
Wow, there's so much to unpack there. So many different places to go with it, especially because it has become so here's an interesting twist. I'd always spoken about music very much the way you were just speaking about it. And then when I started working with plants, I was speaking with somebody who was a musicologist who was explaining to me how we think of music as a language, but really language is a musicality. It is music that is the foundation of everything.
Mm.
It is tone, it is rhythm, it is like all of these elements that then that musicality can be expressed, as you said, through many different ways. You can express that musicality through dance, right? We in Damanhur have something called sacred dance, which is where we take sacred language and it is interpreted through gesture. And it is a direct language where you use the energetic ink of your body to speak directly to the divine, just as sacred language is used as a conduit to speak directly to the divine. So the formulas, as you said, of a ritual, different than like a ceremony, but a ritual which has a formula and a specific, precise way that you do things, then gets interpreted through these different languages, such as sacred language or sacred dance, so that it becomes a faster conduit to reach the divine. You don't go interpreting through the cultural norms that are our traditional languages, whether we're talking about English or Italian or whatever you are now speaking directly into a language that you can communicate with the divine. And we see this all over the place, runes and alchemical languages and symbols. These are all these base significant that mean the same thing. They have very
Mhm.
precise meanings in them in order to, the ogam, like it all goes into this direction that we're going. So once you break everything down to musicality, and you realize that tone, rhythm, inflection, all of it matters. It now, and that of course could be through, you'll notice, I mean, for those that are watching, you'll see that I move a lot. Gesture is very important to me. It is one of my languages. It's one of my musicalities is
Mm.
I understand the world and I can express myself better, whether it's because I'm dancing straight up or whether it's because I'm speaking. I process, and that was one of the things that the plants really brought me back to. I had a plant that's actually sitting right behind me who refused to use any kind of like human language and was very clear that said, if you want to understand yourself and what we can do together, you need to move and you need to come back to gesture because it's always been your form of expression that for cultural reasons, when you're in places like Cubans speak a lot with their bodies. So like when my I had somebody who when they would argue with me, the way they would shut me up was by holding my arms down. Like that was the way to shut me up. So, that gesture has always been a big part of it. And therefore language to me is not so much about an absolute, but it is a conduit to something. So I would say that gesture, it's funny because I was just talking about, and I was exploring, I journal very little, but I move a lot. And I've realized that my journaling is the way that I move. I'm standing
Mm.
around and people always say like, are you jumpy or jittery? And I'm like, absolutely not. I'm processing. I'm almost always in some
Yeah.
kind of motion. And so that has always been the foundation of the way I was and the way I have processed. I've always spoken a lot. And then a lot. My mother tells stories of me having full conversations in my crib with myself. So I've always had a lot of conversation, but it was almost the consequence. The processing doesn't come through that. It comes through gesture and word mixed together. And that was like, and that could be singing, and that could be talking, and that could be in whatever language. So I've studied many languages and I've grasped many different concepts through those different languages. So whether it's talking, whether it's conversing with a plant or conversing with myself or conversing with another human being, to me, it's almost always the same. It's what is the language that allows us to dialogue? And then so with the plant that I said is behind me, it's dance, or it's movement. With a plant that's sitting over Noel, who's another plant that's sitting near me, is more of feeling, where I had another plant that was my plant business partner for a long time before Noel, spider plant, that was about talking. Like I process things with, spider plant through speech. So for me, musicality takes many different forms, and its object is more than anything the sharing with someone else. And therefore that's a great place of where I choose to adapt. So most likely I try to speak in the language that is quote unquote native to whomever it is that I'm speaking with, which is probably the reason I like to learn languages. It's not just because it's one is because it's a window into the culture, but it's also
Right.
because I really enjoy, because I can think so and process so fast. I like being able to have another person speaking to me in a native tongue so that I can really get into it, because when they speak with a native tongue, now it's a whole body speech. Like the body
Right.
gets into it, the feeling gets into it. When they're translating to a foreign language, unless they have complete mastery over that language, there's a part of it that gets stuck in the translation, and that's where the nuance is. So to me, it doesn't really matter who I'm talking to. It's about finding, or who I'm communicating with. I tend to flip to that word. It's how do you best communicate? Is it through
Right.
silence, or is it through words? Is it through dance? Is it through music? Is it, what is it?
Which very much reminds me of what you said about this bridge, right? Because if we're constantly in a state of translation, like having someone to in conversation, there's always some element of translation because we are inherently subjective beings. But to be able to have this understanding, it does bridge and allows less, I don't know, I suppose interference when you are communicating. And I think that's really beautiful. And hearing you talk about how you speak with gestures too, that also very much makes me think of Italian language and culture and communication. Um, and you said more of like a native. I don't know if you used the word native tongue. I don't think you did. I think that's an invention of mine. But would you say that gesture is kind of your preferred personal musicality? The same way you're describing some of your plant partners or relatives as having this preferred musicality of either feeling or movement or speech. Is that gesture? And do you think that we all have something that is kind of unique to us in that way, that is our own preferred musicality, but we just usually don't think of it in those terms or perhaps with that depth?
Yeah, it's interesting, because as you're speaking, I'm thinking, I'm listening, and I'm processing, and I realize that much like the multipotentialite, the multi-passionate mind that I have, um, I think it's even more nuanced than that.
Mm,
And for example, I process in two ways. My internal understanding, complete internal, like for me, definitely comes through movement. Like
mm,
if I'm thinking about, and it almost doesn't matter if I need to feel something, I need to get to the heart of the feeling of it, then it is most definitely coming through, um, some kind of gesture or dance or fluidity of movement. In other words, my body needs to move in order for me to truly feel it. If I need to rationalize something, and this is kind of funny because I've always been, which when I was younger, it felt like a detriment. And now it feels like this massive superpower of being a right brain and a left brain person, of being somebody who is in a very non-traditional way, extremely creative, and at the same time, extremely rational, like very much rational. And so if I want to get into a feeling of something, because I also have aphasia, which means I don't have a visual imagery. I don't imagine pictures in my mind's eye. I don't see those types of things. And I think that, which is just something I discovered only recently. I didn't know that I was different in that
Right.
way. I don't have like images. I can't close my eyes and see something in that way, but I can feel it if I move to it. And whether it doesn't even matter what that is, just the processing. So there is a feeling part of it that comes through the body. And then there is a giving it a shape or a form that I then, for expression, that most definitely comes through words first and foremost. I can use the written word, but for example, the written word for me is not like, I've tried many times to start a book and I know what I want to say. I know what I want to talk about, but the concept of sitting and writing is not as expressive as if I'm sitting and having a conversation with somebody. So dictation is definitely a great thing. But it doesn't even come in dictation. I have to first bring it out in a very kind of processy sort of way, similar to what we're doing right now. So my communication, so different from a traditional dancer that can dance and then let that be an interpretation for somebody else, right? I think where in that pace, their dancing is a way of communication out. My communication mechanism is definitely words across languages and across cultures, for sure. My feeling it deep in my body and my being able to translate from, for example, if I'm teaching a class or if I'm communicating with a plant, I will often stop and you'll see me start moving. And it's because that's how I'm receiving it. And then I can like use my hands to bring it into words that then express out. So my processing is body. My feeling it more than anything, I would say, is body. My processing it for use in something is very much verbal. And again, I pull. So my notebooks are filled with multiple languages because I'll pull concepts based on their cultural norms or on the understandings, because some words like chancleta just mean something different, even though it might be the same thing. And of course I know what a flip-flop is, or I know what, chabatas are, but that's not the concept of la chancleta, like in that perspective. So it's really interesting. And music is for me a cut through of everything. Like traditional music is something that is, it is again, what allows me to be in something. It's such a hard kind of way of trying to put it into, but it is a mechanism that it's funny because even when I listen to a lot of musicals. I actually just recently went to see another musical. And even though that there's lyrics, even when there are lyrics, and I listen to both kinds of music, the lyrics help me think and put a window into myself. It's very rarely me expressing whatever particular song is meant to say, or whatever that artist meant to say with it. It's like a window into a different part of myself.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And I thank you for using language because we're on, a Zoom call. So it's like we can't even really do what we're talking about in a full way, which I can imagine is so difficult. And the thing that I'm asking you to do is describe the ineffability of
Exactly.
your experience.
And imagine that I teach a number of different like workshops and classes and such that have to do with interspecies communication in order to bring out aspects of ourselves that we've kind of have almost no connection to. Everything from plant past lives to what's hanging out in your subtle bodies of your aura, the layers of your aura, to communicating directly with a plant, to getting into your shadow work. My workshops, which are all online, are hysterical when I think about it. When I put them together, at first I think these people are going to think I'm crazy, and then everybody like raves about how much they love it. Because I literally make you stand up. Or in the other day when I was doing, phytoancestry, which is past plant, past lives. I mean, I had people lying on the ground to be moss. And I use a lot of art to bypass all of these cultural and all these like word filters and biases and ways of thinking about it. So art is another form of processing that I use extensively, not as an artist. In other words, this is not about the form that you're doing, Zen tangles and blackout poetry and scribbles on a page and abstract art and stylistic, like break out of whatever it is that are your confines and just because again, I have aphasia. So I don't draw like, okay, yeah, I can draw a stick figure house, but that's about as far as I can go on that traditional method. My notebooks are a disaster of really ugly-ish type stuff, but great processing, man, great processing in it type of thing.
No, I really love this because I think it also speaks to the nuance of what experience is, that we can't like there's a reason why art and plays and musicals and poetry and all of these things and dance exist and always have existed and always will exist, because there is something indescribable and ineffable and numinous about experience, about consciousness that we are trying to get out and also take in at the same time, in this like dialogue between and with each other, and yes, humans, but also other species. And there's something so like layered about the way that you're talking about this too, that I love, describing like one communication or one musicality for feeling, or a different one for processing, and another for integration, and another for actually like useful dissemination. And I think that it really, it's making me think about something else you mentioned in your story, which is sacred geometry, and how it's very like elephants all the way down, where the gyric almost circle of everything, that like the double helix is the movement of the solar system and of our DNA. And in this way, it's like there are vast communications and musicalities that exist across a broader picture that is culture, where we kind of started, but also now on this like interperson and intrapersonal levels as well, that we have all of these different movements. And it's like that also is very much the pattern of sacred geometry, of Fibonacci, this kind of infinitesimal and infinite expansion and contraction that we are confined within, and yet trying to talk about these things. And I'm sure if anyone just hit play at 1 minute and 7 seconds into this podcast, they're like, what in the hell
exactly
is going on? But hopefully if someone's been along on this ride with us, this picture of multiplicity and nuances being painted. So all of that to say, talk to me about the sacred geometry piece. And I know you mentioned having this almost balance between right brain, left brain, but also how you do have a background in tech and engineering. And we also mentioned how like ceremonial and ritualistic magic traditions very much can be formulaic and repetitive in what they teach. And music in a lot of ways is math expressed, right? There's something very technical about these things. And anyone who plays an instrument knows the technique and proficiency that has to go into that. And yet there's also this other element of letting go and flowing that is kind of the quantum level of everything is energy. And yet we have math to describe what these energies are doing. So
Right.
talk to me a little bit about this sacred geometry and for you, existing as the bridge between this left and right brain, what that bridging feels like to you, and how we can take these more experiential elements and consider them in a more technical frame.
Right. Eh, I'm hoping I don't forget some of the things that I should
I'm
have.
sorry, and
No, no,
I'm
no.
all over the
Don't be
place.
don't be sorry at all, because I love it. It was me that like usually always has a piece of paper and a pencil, and this time I didn't. But that's good. It was meant to be that way. So
Mm-hmm.
uh, it's fascinating because as I'm hearing you and as I'm processing through the things that you're saying, I'm kind of putting together pieces that I was just today like kind of contemplating on this whole concept of, the bridge and how that it manifests for me. And, you talk about sacred geometry, which has one element in it. But actually, when I go back and I think about why I first fell in love with Kabbalah, and I fell in love with Kabbalah, besides the overall understanding of kind of how the world of form generates through a series of different major archetypes and of like elements and balancing and how do you flow through these and all these different pieces. One of the other elements that really touched me so deeply was the table of correspondences that the tree of life can
Mm-hmm.
depict, which means that being again a bridge, one of the things I loved was this map of saying I could look at, like, I could have a conversation with my mother who's talking to me about Jesus, which is Tiferet, which is the Buddha, which is also the color gold, which is also, these different elements across angels and archangels and smells and plants and all these different things. So it doesn't matter if we're talking about rose or if we're talking about something else, it's all the exact same things, which means when I listen to people speak or when I smell somebody who walks by me or when I see what they're wearing and the colors and the shapes, all of this enriches my understanding of something. My
Mm-hmm.
understanding passes through all of those different pieces. So that tells me something about who that person, wants to express who they are almost as much as what comes out of their mouth, right? What is it that they're trying to do with that particular, whether it's conscious or unconscious? What are they doing with that particular color? What are they doing with that expression? And it reminds me a lot of, again, going back to the plant music, why plant music to me was so fascinating. One aspect, of course, was the communication perspective. Another was we tend to, as human beings, we need to create order because order is a form of control. It's a way
Mm-hmm.
for me to control my surroundings. I give it predictability so I can understand what comes next. And I really do believe that this is part of our, what I call the original trauma, which is the disconnection from nature. The moment that I disconnected from nature, I lost aspects of my perception organs, like all these different mechanisms that I, as a member as a being of nature, I have all these different ways to perceive temperature and pressure and light, whether we're talking about like sunlight or whether we're talking about other kinds of light. Like I have all these different things inherent in my physical and subtle structure, but that I am disconnected from. So what happens, I have this limited scope that I use, my five main senses, you might say, that we as human beings experience through these five different elements, right? The four main elements plus ether. And I try to then fit everything in a reductionist model inside of these types of elements and these types of senses. But the
Mm-hmm.
world is much richer. But because I can't sense that, I live in fear to a certain extent, an unconscious fear of this huge unknown, which
Right.
society then tells me is bad, right? All of these things that are unknown, unpredictable are bad. What is good is predictability. So therefore, what do? I reduce everything down to a number of shapes and of tonalities that have to have a certain order. I give that the word harmony. I give it a positive definition. And I say anything that's disharmonious, both in a musical sense as well as in a verbal and an action, anything that doesn't match is considered bad in the word disharmonious. So I start to build into my cultural references all of these different kind of controlling type of words and experience. I need to see the future. I will see you later. I dominate with vision because I do not trust my other senses. And so what happens is that we give everything this kind of type box structure. What I love about plants is that they say, screw that.
Mm-hmm.
So if you listen to the music of the plants, you can listen to it in that structured way because the device itself, similar to any musical instrument, right? When I think about a guitar, it has frets. When I think about a piano, it has keys. And if I play in the traditional way that that instrument was, I am going to be speaking a common language that we all understand that is predictable in nature. I will
Mm-hmm.
have chord structures. I will have major and minor and diminished ninths and all these other kinds of different aspects, but they are all codified languages that I have, depending on which ones you use, how big the circle of who understands that language is, right?
Right.
The world of jazz, very different from the classical music world and those types of
Yes.
things.
Yes.
Plants have this in the device. The music of the plants device also does this. It has your traditional major, minor, and diminished and a few other kinds of scales that are connected to pentatonic scales and scales that are connected to other kinds of cultural sounds that give us a window into the expression that that culture wants to share, which is why they use these specific kinds of scales. But it also has something called chromatic, which would be the equivalent of taking a guitar and saying, forget the frets. I'm going to put my fingers wherever the heck I want to put them. And I'm going to make the noise and the sounds as my own expression because that's where my body is naturally taking me. We would hear it and say it's disharmonic. But when you listen to it, it is the expression of the musician. That is another form. They can express through a language we all speak, or they can express in this. And anybody who's listened to experimental music, when I was in college, like I said, I have a degree in music engineering, which is in the School of Music. My favorite ensembles that I used to go see were percussion ensemble because they played things like combs and pencils. And one time a musician who is still a friend of mine, I don't speak to him very often, but he is the drummer for Shakira now.
Oh,
I
how
remember
awesome.
I remember Brendan doing this performance piece where he ran through cans, like those giant cans of tomato sauce that were built in a pyramid. And the song required you to run through it at some point and kick them around and make all the noise of it. And that was part of the performance. So random fact like that.
No, I love it.
And so the point being is when you put plants into the chromatic scale, there is no rhythm or rhyme or harmony. But the more you tap into the plants and tap into that particular plant and to what that plant's expressing, the richness that comes out of that, the expression of that plant now
Mm-hmm.
becomes something that is based on my relationship with the plant, and the plant is using that instrument in that way, very similar to when modern pianists would take the top off and then pull on the strings and create and put things in the strings to create different kinds of sounds when they hit the
Right.
keys, right? Atonal music, which I've always loved, is to me expression of that artist in a non-common language. It's the artist saying, I'm just going to express myself and I leave you to interpreting it or feeling it with whatever sense you want to use in order to get it.
Mm.
Do you lie on the floor and hear how it vibrates across the floor? Or do you sit near it and let it come in through your ears? Or do you open your eyes and see what I'm doing? That's up to you as the listener. And I am not going to dictate what you receive. I am just going to share what I want and you're going to get some piece of it.
Mm-hmm.
Versus, like I said, codified music that has kind of arcs and peaks and bridges and choruses and all these different elements that then allows us to transmit in a different way.
Right. I have so many questions and so many places I want to go, but before we dig in further, could you give us a little bit more insight into how plant music is actually created, and the kind of technical instrument piece of how you are capturing the musicality.
Fair enough. True. I didn't say that. So the
No,
music
that's
of
all right.
the music of the plant's device, what it does is it captures. So plants have an electrical system similar to the way we do. We have neurons that fire. They also have what's called action potentials and that fire throughout their body. So what this device does is it captures the difference between the leaf, a leaf of the plants, whatever kind of plant that plant might be, and the root system or the ground. So it takes the electrical impedance between these two. And what we have found over time is that as plants play, they recognize that they're the ones making that music because basically that impedance gets mapped onto notes of music through a MIDI interface. So it takes that electrical impulse and then it says, okay, over a period of time, these are the peaks and the valleys, and this is the way where that electrical impedance goes. And therefore, I'm going to map that and I'm going to say, this is middle C. And this over here is like, one octave lower. And this is what D looks like. In other words, it maps that on. So the algorithm is constantly checking what is the plant actually producing electricity wise, and then how does that map onto the notes of music? And then the device takes, and then according to, again, you can set the scale. You can also set a little bit like what's the max amount of notes that a plant can play per minute or per second. And then you can also set the actual tonality. If you do it for a performance where you're trying to kind of go human to human, you would set it all. If you're working very closely with a plant, and especially if it's not just for performance reasons, but maybe for expression, like I think of it as the plant wants to present themselves, present himself. Or if you're doing it more for a healing perspective, which is another way that plant music is often used as a form of healing and a healing therapy, then you're most likely going to set it with the plant, where you're going to sit there with the device for a long time, playing through all the notes, going, what do you want? Like, and you'll hear it. Like it's something that comes
Right.
over time of working with that plant. And so the device really is just it's literally a musical instrument. It just interprets. And then the plant, similar to when I'm playing the piano, I have to know, how do I set my hands in order for me to play? If I'm going to play, E sharp, or if I'm going to play, F, what is it, which is the same, what is it that I'm going to do, right? Like how do I set my hands up in order to do it? And so the plant
Right.
learns these action potentials, like this potentiality then does this. So that's how the device works.
Similarly to, okay, if I know I need to play C, then I need to move this finger, which is actually a neuron firing in a specific way to generate that noise. The
Exactly.
plant is saying, I need this action potential to fire in this way to generate this
Correct.
frequency. That is so helpful and so fascinating. And I am going to go on a deep dive of listening to plant music after this. I do want to go back to a little bit of this conversation around harmony, because one thing that in so many movements around spirituality and connection and I love this idea of moving towards positivity, and I don't ever want to poo-poo like we're moving in a positive direction, right?
I
Like
do it all the
growth
time.
and
I poo-poo it all the time. We're all good.
not everything is love and light,
No.
and light casts shadow.
Absolutely.
And if everything is ultimately about balance, that means creating space for things that we may, through our discursive language, ascribe badness to. And some things may sound disharmonious that isn't that actually in some ways harmony, because we are bringing that balance back into the equation, even if these notes sound a little like, oh, there's something different there. It is expressing a truth of experience, because we all know what it feels like to feel like a record scratch when someone says something to you and it's like, excuse me, what just happened? And it's
Right.
like, no one made that sound, no one made that noise, but that felt quote unquote disharmonious. And you said it was communicating something beyond the good and bad in a non-common language, just allowing the musician, the artist, to express, and then almost the meaning making comes in through witnessing, listening, receiving that frequency. And that the word that I wrote down as you were talking about this was truth. That in this ultimate balance, perhaps that is non-commonly what is being described as personal truth, but also I think in the same way, going back to what we were talking about at the beginning, about language and how the word will carries so many different meanings. There's a reason why we tell fiction stories, even though they're false, even though they're lies, because they tell some broader truth about the human experience in this life and energies and everything. Talk to me about harmony and disharmony and trying to bring these things into balance and how we can create space for shadow, for quote unquote darkness and tension through wanting to also move the needle towards community and I don't know, collective freedom maybe is a good way to say it. It's hard to even describe what the ultimate end goal may be, but I think you understand what I'm asking, and I would love to just hear thoughts.
You're touching one of my favorite subjects, because I would first and foremost argue that we're actually not looking for balance. I was somebody who used the word balance for a long period of time, but balance is a state. And what we're really looking for, in my opinion, is flow. And the reason is because if you are balanced always, there is no growth, because you need to step out of that. You need to have movement in order for growth to happen. It goes back to what we were talking about, is when do I integrate versus when do I accept? When do I adapt versus when do I hold firm? Right? These are not absolutes. And so to a certain extent, the difficulty, or sometimes the challenges that's coming out of this New Age movement, and it's not just a New Age, there's lots of groups that do it. And I come from the New Age movement, so I don't have anything like bad about New Age in general, is that sometimes we're getting stuck in certain terms, and it is the stuckness that is a problem overall. In other words, there is nothing every trait that we have, every experience, every thought process has its, we're mixing up good and bad for constructive and destructive, when something is almost always both, right? I can use anything. I used an example recently of an axe. And I said, in the hands of somebody who knows how to use an axe, right? You have an incredibly powerful weapon that helps you chop, that helps you clear, that helps you you can pound on things. Like, there's so many things an axe can do. An axe also cuts off your limbs, can potentially hurt you really badly, can kill you, and all this. We would think of these as like light and shadow. But the truth of the matter is they're just two sides of the exact same thing, which is which one is most useful in that time. Am I supposed to chop wood, or honestly, am I supposed to be butchering an animal? And I'm going to be using that same axe because that's the tool that I have. And I'm still doing the exact same thing, and I'm giving it a good or a bad based on what? Based on its function, based on its usefulness in the moment. And it's the same thing with balance and movement, or static and flowing, right? We need to learn how to do all of them. We need light and we need shadow, because shadow is usually the destructive side of something, where the light is the constructive, but they are not good or bad. Because if I need to, clear, if I have a tree that is downed, I need to use that axe to destroy. I need to cut down things, and I need to if instead I'm trying to build a house and I don't have a hammer, I can use that axe as a hammer, and there it's constructing something. It's both of them are good, because that's what I needed. But when I needed to construct, if I used a destructive piece, then that's the bad. And so
Mm-hmm.
that's the part that's not useful. And so we're sort of hurting ourselves because we're trying to, again, going into these neat little control boxes, we are
Right.
trying to put talents, skills that we have into, oh, well, I need to have balance. Are you sure? Because if you have a
Right.
lot of balance, you're not growing. You're not going anywhere. You're not
Yeah.
creating that dissonance that we sometimes hear in music, right? Like you said, it's the record scratch. It like jars you out. Is that bad? No, that's good when I need to catch your attention, when I need
Mm-hmm.
to move your body in a way, when I need to give you an impact.
Yeah. It's making me think of how like we need horns on cars for safety, right? It's
Right.
like it is shocking, it is dissonant on purpose for
Exactly.
to serve its purpose. And it's so funny you say this about the axe because I've been saying this about hammers recently where
Same thing.
you can use it to build a house or you can use it to brain somebody. And it's
Ex-
like the hammer in and of itself is not good or bad. And just everything you're speaking to is so resonant with my definition of coherence, which is my whole other theory kind of thing. And so I'm just, yes, 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 yes. And I
yeah.
love this. And I love also what you're saying about flow and perhaps instead of balance, because it also makes me think of like when our bodies get sick and we get a fever to internally like kill off the
Right.
things that are harming us. We're not in balance at that moment, but our body is working in perfect flow, in perfect
Exactly.
coherence for what we need to survive, to get well, to be healthy. And truthfully, health is then about how quickly you return back. It's about the traveling in between. It's about the bridge. It's about the
Exactly.
bridge in between the two. And I love how you're talking about these. It's just making me excited and I love it.
Yeah.
Um, I do want to get a little bit into this idea of consciousness because I know as we're talking about plant music, but also you mentioned in your story how I think you briefly said you had a plant business partner, and
Uh-huh.
correct me if I'm wrong in any language I'm using. Um,
I'm looking
but
at
I would
you.
love to hear I would love to hear how your philosophy of mind informs these relationships that you have and I'll just leave it at that. Your philosophy of mind and how that informs the relationships you have.
Yeah, my philosophy of mind has grown exponentially since I started working with plants because I'm realizing that we, again, in our reductionist sort of way of of being as human beings, we have a tendency to want to think of mind in terms of brain, and brain and mind are not the same thing, which is why plants do have mind even though they don't have brain, and why we also mind is much more extensive across our body. So working with plants has really helped me to understand that mind is about awareness. Mind is about being able to use my entire sensory field, right? And bring that sensory field into a state of presence so that then I can work with I kind of like I can pull from my past to make decisions for my future, but by living in the present. And so mind is my ability to coordinate all of that. And it comes from so many different senses, which is why mind is not always just the brain, because the brain might operate the physical perspective of many of the things that we do. But we also know that there's like gut mind, right? We know that there is a master control center that works in that perspective. And we also know for many of us that have like a spiritual background that there is something that is unknown to us, that we feel it, right? We know it's there. And that is also a series of sense organs, both physical and non-physical, like physical, not recognized, and non-physical, that we're pulling in through and that we're using that to inform. And all of that comes into presence. And I believe, and so consciousness really is that element of bringing all this in, bringing in my sensory, being aware of who I am. And that's why the more you know yourself, the more you know your talents, the more know your skills, the more mastery you have over who you are, makes it easier for you to make decisions, for you to choose where to go, for you to really exercise what the mind is and how the mind operates. And this is what I love about working with plants, because our humanness is very much tied to our animalness, the fact that we are animals, and therefore there's a movement, an instinctual nature that passes through rapid movement. Plants are sessile, rooted into the ground, can't run away, which means they can have developed this expansive definition of mind that includes a rich sensory field, because I have to deal with things. I can't just hide or run away from it. And then to be able to live in the present, because it's dangerous for me to be off in the past or to be floating around in the future. I need to be able to make decisions now. And because I'm rooted, my decisions are going to take a while in order for them to come into effect. So there's a strategy around that and a movement that happens and a lot of experimentation. And so working with plants has helped me to better understand all of it as mind, rather than trying to think of, oh, mind is in this little tiny box and it acts in this particular way. Mind is about expanding your sensors so that you act as full sensor and can bring in so much more data. And mind is also about being able to be present to the situation and work and digest and process and apply all of that is coming in, not based on somebody else's conditioned response, right? Not based on what somebody else tells me, but based on a deep understanding of who I am. Like consciousness really emanates from awareness, and this is another place where languages helps, because when you start going into kind of the word for consciousness across multiple languages, you start to hear all the different synonyms that are used that helps you realize, oh, wow, how limited I am when I'm only in one language. And then you apply that to the plant mind, and all of a sudden you get this other richness that comes out of it. And so that awareness and that consciously moving things forward really just changes the way that you deal with things. And it takes that fear factor out, because now, even if I make a mistake, it's still mine to make, right? It's coming from a place of informed and decision making, and therefore I'm much easier to take responsibility and also to give myself space, because those unknowns are always going to be there, but I also know what I have mastery over, and I can focus on those types of pieces. Hopefully that made sense. It's a complicated topic.
Yes. It very much is. No, it absolutely makes sense to me. One thing I do want to make sure I'm grasping, when you speak about mind, are you using that interchangeably with this notion of consciousness, or do you see a distinction there?
I see it's a really good question. I think in general, when I think about mind with a capital M, I think of it as interchangeable with consciousness, because but I do recognize that what we as kind of currently use as mind has different physiological pieces. Like I said, like brain mind versus heart mind versus gut mind versus subtle body mind. I feel like there are little m minds all over the place, and that we as humans maybe don't always recognize all of them, but I do believe that they're there. And anybody who, that we call it emotional
Mhm.
sometimes it's also considered intelligence when it comes to like emotional intelligence, musical intelligence, like logical intelligences. These are all the application of multiple intelligences can be synonymous to little m mind, versus consciousness, which I feel like is synonymous to capital M mind. It's probably the best way I can describe it in that way.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think that makes really great sense to me. Um, with this, it almost sounds, and I don't know if you would even want to nail it down in this way, because I know I certainly hesitate to not want to be pinned down to any theories that are sort of out there. But there is, like, the idea of panpsychism is definitely coming up for me, and this idea that
Right.
mind is or consciousness is somewhat foundational and existing in and through all things. Is that close to something that you're talking about, or do you feel that it is tied a little bit more to an entity or to physicality in this certain sense? Um, Yeah, I don't know if that
Yeah.
makes sense,
I've
but
gone
I'd love to
through,
hear.
what is it? The what's it called? Is it the Stanford Encyclopedia of Consciousness so many times because there's so many. I think it's the Stanford. I can't remember
Oh,
exactly. And I love this and but I agree with you. I mean, I think the definition of all the definitions that probably closer fills how I feel it and see it and have experienced it is probably panpsychism, for the reasons that you just mentioned. The idea
okay.
that we have this sort of running consciousness through us, and then I think there's, we specialize it based on, again, form and sensors and development and such. But there is a kind of universal thread. And I believe we manifest it through, like you said, entities, or through, whether we're talking about divinities or whether we're talking about others. I think we focus it and connect into that energetic thread, and then that informs what we do. But I do think everything and everybody, and when I say everybody, it's a wide, like, person is wide, defining rock person, human person, plant person, right? There's so many more than human beings out there that we have yet to really truly recognize and understand, that experience also that consciousness in a very different way. The definition and the
Mm-hmm.
spread between collective consciousness versus independence, and where does the independence fit? Like, especially when we're talking about plants, that's something that can really challenge you on, and in a good way, because I think that they force you to not use so many restrictive labels, but allow you to have the space of, like, when I have a plant, like, for example, Jaina, who's an aloe plant right here, and I'm looking at when I've taken, parts of Jaina and started a new plant. And actually, as a matter of fact, the plant that's right behind me, the one I was talking about, who is the one that works with me for movement, um, the one when we were working together, at one point that plant was divided, and I was working literally in a research group, a spiritual research group, around this topic of working specifically with this plant on this movement-based piece. And I spent a good amount of time, it must have been a few months, looking at both of the plants saying, which one of you is the plant I'm working with? And it was really a fascinating exercise, because I was in the middle of this research project with a group of people. And now all of a sudden I had two, and I'm like, am I working with both of you? Are you both? I call Keen no name Dracenna, because doesn't want to give me a name. And I'm like, am I actually working with both of you? Or is one of you? And in the end, it turned out to be one that was like, no, it's me. You're working with me. This one over here, we were together. And when we were together, you were working with us as a whole. But now that we're divided, this one over here is a different entity from me. And I am the one that is hosting, or have hosted, what we're working on. So you reference me now. And it was a really crazy kind of period, because I was trying not to go with human biases. Like, and of course there's still a little bit of doubts. It's like, am I doing that for visuals? Like, is it because of the pot? Like, but ultimately, this is the plant, and over the years, that I've always looked at for that particular thing.
Wow. I just find this so beautiful and fascinating, especially in going back to what you said about the original trauma being a disconnection from nature and a separation, and being almost like ripped out of the ground and unearthed as a humanity. Um, and using this and just listening to your stories as this integration is just really beautiful to listen to. Um, to you, how do you experience this? I know we talked a little bit earlier about the communication that you have, and how with some plants it is definitely more movement based versus more feeling based versus more language based, depending on which entities or persons you're working with. How would you describe it to someone who has no concept? Like, they're listening to this and they're like, "You're talking to a plant?" Question mark. I
Right.
think I have a subtle understanding of what um you're meaning here, but how would you describe that experience? And is it something that feels kind of like a download or a glimmer or an insight, or is it something that really feels like communicatory? I don't want to put any words in your mouth, so I'll let you share.
Yeah, I actually, so I have because I teach on this subject, I have something called a mini voyage with plants. That is specifically with spirit wild plants. So wild plants like dandelion and stinging nettle and purslane that you can work with, because it is such a, for those that have absolutely no experience with it, is very different from just like I ingest, like, oh, I go and I, eat dandelion or I eat purslane. It's also very different from, that's it can be one form of communication, to just eat and or to be with. But I think over time, what ends up happening is that you have the opportunity to open, again, going back to those senses. And I start usually with people with shared breath, because that is usually the easiest way of
Mm,
entering into a relationship with a plant. We know plants give oxygen. We know we give carbon dioxide. They take in our carbon dioxide. We take in their oxygen. So just starting with a shared breath allows me to form that first level bond with a plant, like to start to connect and reconnect. And almost everything I do is called reconnect, because it really is about reconnecting back into that natural world and that
mm,
natural part of myself. And then from there, I usually tend to start with different senses. I tend, as much as possible, to eliminate wording too much at the beginning, because I think there are many, many, many plant communicators. I was at a conference last year. I presented at a conference where there was many different plant communicators, and most of them tend to be verbal, which I think is great. I mean, everybody has their thing.
mm,
I tend to try to kill two things. One is the verbal processing, and the other one is your sight, because it is our dominant sense, and it oftentimes biases us, just the same as it can bias us with other human beings. It biases us with plants. Like, I see a big tree and I think, oh, you must have a huge energy. And when I do things with blindfolds, I have consistently found certain plants that everybody's like, this plant has a humongous, energy. I can feel all this. And it's like a teeny tiny little, cactus or something like that. So it's really about, so I work a lot to eliminate sight and to eliminate verbal at the very
mm,
beginning. And I start from shared breath. And then from there, I tend to do exercises that take you through your senses. So, for example, if you go to my YouTube, you will find a series of meditations. Also, I'm also an insight timer inside of my online community, the Naturally Conscious community, that take you through kind of expanding your other senses, like what happens when you truly smell a plant, or when you really touch plants in a variety of different ways. And then from there, the expression, I tend to take people through both movement as well. So movement in drawing, in music, in poetry, in things that are not so linear as regular speech. So one part
mhm,
of it is the input, and I try to take people through a variety of different things. That's touching, that's tasting, that's smelling, that's breathing, that can be sitting in silence and seeing what comes and stepping out of disbelief a little bit. It can also be, moving and seeing what comes. And then the expression of that, which is often drawing or dancing or poetry or anything that is a little bit more non-linear, so that you give yourself space. And then
mhm,
doing that. And so, like, for example, I have a quiz on my website that's a spirit wild plant. I have a number of activities that I send you afterwards to just do, to just be with that plant and to try some of these little, very simple activities. Take a few minutes, even if it's with just the picture of a plant, and to get into that space, especially if you have house plants, and working just starting every day, say hello and just sit for a second and see what comes. It doesn't have to be a massive, long, downloaded conversation. I've worked with plants that are like that are very prolific. And so you sit there and you're like literally feverishly writing things down. Or, like I said, with the plant that I
sure.
dance with, I could spend, I could just walk around my house and like move and dance and collapse and whatever, and then just what does that feel like for me? And many times now, and I have an expanded plant communication workshop that I do. It it doesn't always have to translate through the literal mind. Like sometimes you just feel something, and when I do, like I do a type of reading, like a tarot type reading with a deck that is a botanical tarot. And do not ask me how I understand what the heck I'm saying. I have no freaking clue. I just know when, these plants are speaking to me in their own way, and words and sometimes I sit there for a second and the person's looking at me. I'm like, give me a sec, because there's a whole series of feelings and of things that are coming through, and I've got to give them words, any type of piece. So I
Right.
think the beauty of working with the more than human world is that it's a little bit even better than working with humans, because with humans, we tend to think that the only way I'm supposed to work with you is by talking to you. Or if I'm a dancer, I have to dance with you. Or if I'm this, I have to do it this way. But the beauty of working with a plan is that just the same as you can have all these different mechanisms, I can sit there and be like, just show me what mechanism works. And I can develop that because it's reattaching a sensor that I probably do not have connected. So it's going to take me some time to reconnect that sensor. I
Mm.
have that sensor. It's there. It's in my body. I have no doubt about that. But it's going to take you a minute. So everything I do is with a plant partner. Every workshop I give, every, podcast episode I do, every discussion or any course that you might take with me, one of the first things I will ask you is, where's your plant partner? And the second question will be drawing materials, paints and notebook, like not journaling, art materials, because you don't know how this plant is going to communicate with you. And you just want to be open to
Mm-hmm.
capturing it in whatever way feels right. And don't worry about interpretation. I don't talk about interpretation at all. Interpretation is way
Yeah.
later. Capture it. Open that sensor, turn it back on, get it there. Then later we'll figure out what the heck is being said
Yeah.
to you.
Reconnect.
Mhm.
I love that. Thank you so much for sharing. I think that that's so enlightening for me personally, but I think also it just I was about to say, but it's just so maybe a really good way to say this. It really paints a picture of
Mhm.
what this process is like and why it is reconnective, and not just stagnant and discursive and linear. I
Mhm.
do want to take us into the closing out of our conversation. You have been so very generous with your time. Thank you so much, Tigrilla. And my final two questions before we sign off. One, of course, links to your YouTube, your Insight Timer, all of the places that people can find you, can learn from your work, can check out your workshops. All of that will be linked down below in the description wherever people are listening or watching. So definitely to all of our listeners, please, please, please go check it out. But in light of our conversation, is there anything that we missed that we didn't get a chance to get to that you want to return to and highlight? Anything you want to clarify? Anything at all that you would like to add to this conversation? This is time for you to do that.
I would say that one of the elements that I think we touched on, but I want to highlight it a little bit, is that when you start working with the more than human world, you realize that it isn't about good and bad. That judgment is very, very limited and can be used, but in only very specific circumstances. Instead, it's about how useful something can be. So whether I'm using a trait or a
Mm,
characteristic, everything that you are, never do you have anything that is inherently bad in you. You have, is it the most appropriate time and is it the most useful for me to use it in this moment? And then it could to like a lot of more subtleties, like, how much of it to use, for how long of it to use it, in what direction do I use it, and things like that. But first and foremost, it's just, does the function match what I need? And therefore, how do I apply it? And that doesn't matter if that's constructive or destructive, right? So all of your traits, people who try to tell you, oh, you got to like get rid of that trait, or you got to get rid of that like piece of you, or, oh, that's just coming and that's bad. Ignore them. They're wrong, in my opinion. Like, really, this is about figuring out how to master your parts and use that in every which way that comes.
Mm. I love that. Thank you for sharing that. The thing that occurred to me is the poison is in the dose, which of course everything you're saying is so much more
Exactly.
nuanced than that. But I think that there is something to that. My very last question, to hopefully put a little bow or button on this beautifully expansive conversation we've had, is what is one word to describe how you are feeling right now?
So interesting. One word of how I'm feeling right now. It's funny, it's not exactly the most beautiful of all words, but it is the one that feels right. Useful. I feel like the thing I love about this conversation is that while it
Mm.
has been very philosophical in so many different ways, it's also, I think, extremely useful. It's things that people can take and apply into their lives, even if it's just as a concept, but also as a practice.
Yes, absolutely. I certainly think so and hope so as well, that because I found this so useful. I hope it is for our listeners too. But to Tigrilla, thank you so very much for your time and expertise here today. I've so enjoyed our conversation.
Me too. Thank you so much. This was wonderful.
Thank you all so very much for being here today. And of course, a huge thank you to Tigrilla for her time and energy during this episode. I saved it for the season finale of season 4. There were a few other episodes I pushed up in the order so that this one could be the last one, because there have just been some banger of an episodes lately, and this one, it just hit such a profound place for me during what I've been researching, and how deeply that is tying in with what we talked about in this episode and what I'm working on both personally and professionally right now. And I just had so many breakthrough moments. I'm like, my notes look like a crazy person wrote them, because there's just so much richness here, and I just have so much appreciation for Tigrilla and everything that she brought to this conversation, and I hope that you found just as much, if not more, wisdom and inspiration from this episode. Again, if you are interested in any of Tigrilla's offerings, there will be links in the description box down below, wherever you may be listening to or watching this podcast, to check her out and support her work. Please do. And if you are interested in Making Meaning, the heart behind the podcast, or the Cohere Collective, the brain thought child that exists behind the podcast as well, there will be links down below to the website that explains more about me, my mission, my purpose, and what the heck it is we're doing over here at the Cohere Collective. A huge thank you to Nicole Ostreicher for Making Meaning's art and podcast cover. You can find her on Instagram at Nicole O Creates and Nicole O Design. A huge thank you to Tristan Morgan for Making Meaning's theme music. You can find him on Instagram at Tristan Morgan. And if you want to follow along with even more coherent content, you can give us a follow across all of the social medias, all at the Cohere Collective. Right now, I am feeling inspired. Truly is the word that's coming to mind. Reflecting on this conversation, I just feel so empowered to take action on all of the things that I learned. And it really validated so much of my own work, because I think I often feel a lot of pressure to do the research and academically and quantitatively back up every single thought and opinion that I have, that I am putting out publicly. And not to say that that's not important. Of course, we should be testing all of our hypotheses, right? But also, there is this added layer of the ineffability of what it is that we're talking about. And the human experience can't be quantified. Consciousness can't be quantified. Like, that's why these things are so confusing and complex and magical and enamoring. And that's why these should be the conversations we're having. And this conversation was just such a permission slip for me to keep talking about my thoughts in a way that is important and profound, and not needing to have all of the answers exactly correct with every single T crossed and every single I dotted before experimenting with my thoughts and putting them out there and daring to be wrong and failing forward through that experience, and knowing that, especially in a world of philosophy and consciousness and experience, actually some of the most powerful concepts are the ones that we know that we can't know. And that's not just okay, but a good thing. Thank you all so very much for being here tonight and for the entirety of season 4. This has been my favorite season yet. Truly, every season gets better and better, and I feel like the conversations we have just get deeper and deeper, and of course we make more and more meaning, which is just always such a joy and a ball and a blast, and I just have so much energy to keep this going. Quick note, one thing you will notice is I'm actually going to transition in season 5 to no longer having seasons. So there really won't be a season 5. We're just going to keep counting up the episodes. So that will begin with episode 80 or 81, I believe, something like that, because each season thus far has had 20 episodes. So you'll notice that the way that we're keeping track of episode numbers in wherever your podcast listening system of choice is, it'll look a little bit different in terms of numbers, but all of your favorite episodes will still be there. And everything else will stay exactly the same in terms of format and all of the meaning that you can expect. The numbers will just look a little different. Thank you all so very much for being here and for being truly, truly, truly my favorite part of the meaning-making process. And as always, I hope you feel like you are living more coherently. Until next time, love.